auctions. The word conjures up some vivid images. The refined decor of auction houses like Christie's or Sotheby's, selling million-dollar paintings to bidders who signal with a nod of a head or the tip of a finger. A livestock sale with a fast-talking auctioneer running his barely intelligible chant. The selling of an old home's contents. An antique table has caught the crowd's fancy, and feverish bids spiral higher and higher. The images may be vivid, but they may also seem remote from your personal experience. Even so, auctions are going on around you all the time and have considerable impact on your life. Since the founding of eBay in 1995, there's been an explosion of online auction sites. Tens of millions of people make purchases each month, resulting in tens of billions of dollars of annual sales. Auctions have a natural niche. They're a great way of transacting business for scarce goods when it's difficult to establish an appropriate market value for that good. In my first lecture, I mentioned how the U.S. Treasury raised billions of dollars by auctioning off the radio spectrum. In spring 2008 alone, the FCC spectrum auction brought in more than $19 billion. That's serious money. Even with a national economy, it's pushing 1% of the federal budget. On a more prosaic level, auctions are important to you every time you do a web search with a service like Google. The paid ads that you see when you type in the search words are determined by auction, and Google's auction system is exceptional. Over 99% of the revenues for the company come from advertising, and Google's market capitalization is over $100 billion. But what do I mean by saying that Google's auction system is exceptional? Don't all auctions use the same system? In a word, no. We just saw in the last lecture that there are many different kinds of voting systems. There are also many different kinds of auctions. Today, I want to talk a bit about those different types, their advantages, disadvantages. I also want to talk about some attractive features and some dangers of auctions, both to buyers and sellers. Let's get a feeling for the landscape. For the moment, assume that a single object is being auctioned. How much is that object worth? Well, if the answer to that question were the same for everyone and were known to everyone exactly, then there wouldn't be an auction. Imagine auctioning off a $100 bill. It's not hard to imagine that it would be sold for $100. No, auctions are going to occur when there's a difference in opinion about the worth of an object. This difference of opinion could be from two different sources. The first possibility is that each bidder knows what the object is worth to them, but not what it's worth to the other bidders. In 2006, Christie's had a huge auction of Star Trek memorabilia. How much is a model of the Enterprise from Star Trek: The Next Generation worth? Clearly the answer is different for different people. That makes it a private value auction. Christie's expected to fetch somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000. It sold for $576,000, over $500,000. Again, in a private value auction, what it's worth is what it's worth to you. But one can also auction, for example, drilling rights for oil. The tract being auctioned will provide a certain amount of oil, so presumably the actual value of the tract is the same for all the bidders. Trouble is, nobody's sure what that value is. Each bidder has an estimate of the true value, and they're all scattered around the actual value. This is the structure of a common value auction. Auctions can also be categorized a different way, as open outcry or sealed bid. Auctions that spring to mind when you think of auctions are open outcry. Anyone at the auction can make a bid, and these bids are observable by all the bidders. It goes until it stops. The easy way to imagine a sealed bid auction, as the name suggests, is to imagine that each bidder secretly places his or her bid in an envelope, then seals it. An overseer then opens up all the envelopes and awards the object to the highest bidder. Bidding on job contracts is often done by sealed bid, with the job going to the contractor who submits the lowest price for completing the job. Both open outcry and sealed bid auctions have their own variants. For open outcry auctions, the most familiar is the ascending or English auction. Bidders continue to make higher and higher bids until no one wishes to bid any further. At that point, the person making the last bid wins the object and pays for the bid. A less known variant is the descending or Dutch auction. The name comes from the way that tulips and other perishables are auctioned off in the Netherlands. In this kind of auction, the auctioneer starts by naming a high price and continues to lower it until some bidder accepts that price. The bidder wins the object and pays his or her bid. For the sake of time, such auctions are often conducted using an auction clock, whose hand counts down from high prices to low. When the bidder stops the clock, he or she wins the auction and pays the price on the clock. So actually only one bidder takes action during a Dutch auction. Sealed bid auctions, too, come in two varieties. The obvious one is what's generally referred to as a first price auction. The bidder pays whatever it was that he or she bid. But an interesting variant called the victory auction or second price auction works like this. The high bid again wins the object, but the money paid is equal to the second highest bid. Such a system sounds rather bizarre at first blush, but we'll soon see it's a perfectly sensible alternative. In fact, there's a natural correspondence between the types of sealed bid auctions and the types of open outcry ones. Let me explain. Let's start again with the Dutch auction, the descending auction. The money clock runs down until some bidder accepts the current price, stopping the clock, and the bidder pays that price. If you think about it, this is exactly how a first price sealed bid auction works. Each bidder has specified the price at which they would be willing to buzz in and stop the clock. The person with the highest price would buzz in first. They win, and they pay their bid. But that isn't the case for the English or ascending auction that we're used to. The bidding starts low. If the current bid is less than the highest offer that I'm willing to make, I don't simply jump to my highest offer. No, I increase my previous bid by a penny, or the least amount at which it's allowed to be incremented given the rules of the auction. Behavior continues this way until no one's willing to outbid the current highest bidder. What this means is that the price paid by the winner isn't the maximum that bidder would offer. Instead, it's a tiny amount more than the maximum that the second highest bidder would offer. Once you pass the threshold of the second highest bidder, the object's yours. What this means is that within a very small amount, the winner of the English auction is the one who's willing to bid highest, but he only pays, essentially, the second highest bid. And this, of course, is exactly the system of second price sealed bid auctions, the victory auction that we just talked about. The idea does seem strange to most people, but it's entirely workable. If I believe that a painting is worth $10,000 and the next highest bidder thinks it's worth only $3,000, then in either system, I pay $3,000 or $3,000 and change and walk out with the painting. So, if you're going to be bidding on an object in a sealed bid auction, which would you prefer? A first price auction or a second price one? Sounds like a rather moronic question, doesn't it? Would you rather pay the highest price or the second highest price? But given that you've studied game theory so far, you know that there's more to it than that. Remember the lesson of sequential games. Earlier decisions can change later ones. Knowing what kind of auction that they're in can influence the bids that people make. Let's see how. We'll start out with a first price sealed bid auction for a common value object. That is, everybody gets to make one bid, and whoever pays the highest bid wins. Since it's a common value object, the common value is worth the same. It's worth the same thing to every buyer, but no one knows for sure how much that is. Well, let's start out small, assuming that you're the only bidder. In such a case, the seller is sure to have a reservation price. That is, there's a price below which the seller won't sell, although that price is generally not known to the bidders. Imagine, for instance, a used car dealer selling a car. To the dealer, the car is merchandise. To you, it's transportation. So let's say that you've established that whatever the car is worth to the dealer, it's worth 50% more than that to you. A car worth $4,000 to the dealer would then be worth $6,000 to you, and so on. I'm going to make the math simple. So let's say that the car that you're interested in is worth somewhere between $0 and $6,000 to the dealer, and that every price in that range is equally likely. The question is, what should you offer for the car, given that you only get to make one bid? If my setup sounds kind of like the market for lemons, good for you. It is. Because the salesman is only going to sell the car if you offer him more than it's worth to him. So, suppose that you offer P dollars, and that if your offer is accepted, it means that the car was worth P dollars or less to the dealer. Its value to the salesman, therefore, is any number between 0 or P dollars, with them all being equally likely. That means on average, the car is going to be worth P over $2, 1/2 P, to the salesman. Now, to you, we said, it's worth 50% more than that. That means that it's worth 3/4 P to you. That is, no matter what you offer, the fact that your offer was accepted means that, on average, the car is worth only 3/4 of what you paid for it. Okay, let's make this a true auction. I'm going to get rid of the reserve price and add more bidders. The car is actually worth the same to each bidder, but no bidder knows exactly what that amount is. As an example, imagine that the car was really worth $5,000 to any bidder. Some bidder might think the car is worth $4,500, one might think $4,800, another $5,000. This one thinks it's worth $5,200, that one $5,500. But nobody knows anybody else's evaluation. Who do you think would tend to win this auction? Well, obviously, no one's going to bid more for the car than they think that it's worth. But if the bid gets to $5,100, there are still two bidders who believe, mistakenly, that the car is worth more than this. If each bidder is willing to go up to their personal valuation of the car, then bidding stops at $5,200, plus change. The person who believed the car was worth $5,500 will continue to go, while the $5,200 person will stop. The $5,500 person will buy the car and discover that they've paid too much, $5,200 for a $5,000 car. A moment's reflection will make it clear that this is going to happen regularly in any common value auction. The very fact that you won means that you thought the item was worth more than almost everyone else did, which probably means that your estimate was actually too high. You probably overpaid. This is what we call the winner's curse, and it's not a mathematical abstraction. A common exercise done in game theory classes is to auction off a jar of pennies. The teacher almost always makes money on this deal because of the winner's curse. Everyone in the class has to make a guess of how much they think the pennies are worth. The winner of the auction is the person who's going to bid the highest, and that's probably because they think that there's more pennies in the jar than other people. The very fact they win means they probably overestimated the value of the money in the jar. Dixit and Skeeth provide some very nice real-world examples. They say there's considerable evidence that winners of oil and gas drilling leases pay considerably more than what that lease is actually worth and take substantial losses. Free agents in baseball who are signed by a new team tend to be paid more than equally good players who re-sign with their original team. Richard Thaler has an interesting discussion of this phenomenon in general in his book, The Winner's Curse. So what does it mean? Does it mean that in a common value auction, the winner is generally a loser? Not necessarily. To avoid the winner's curse, it's necessary that bidders shade their bids. That is, they have to bid less than their estimates of what the item is worth. The right question isn't, how much am I willing to pay if I think this item is worth $5,000? The right question is, how much am I willing to pay if I think this item is worth $5,000 and no one else is willing to bid above me? Because that's the only time that you're going to win anyway. So, how much should you shade? That question's an important one, but answering it's hard. It requires integral calculus and a fair amount of probability theory. In fact, a lot of auction theory is very mathematically sophisticated. The point to keep in mind, though, is this. If you don't shade your bid in a common value auction, you're quite likely to fall victim to the winner's curse. Okay, let's turn our attention to private value auctions. We'll assume that each bidder knows the value of the object to him or herself, its private value, but doesn't know the private valuations of the other bidders. The winner's curse isn't really going to be a problem in this case. You know what the item's worth to you, so in that sense at least, you can't overpay. On the other hand, do you really want to pay what you think the item is worth? Let's start by considering the Dutch auction, or equivalently, the sealed bid first price auction. Let's imagine that the value of the object, to me, is worth $100. Well, certainly, I wouldn't want to bid more than $100 for it, of course, But if I bid $100 exactly, then either I lose, which means I gain nothing, or I win, which means I gain nothing. It's kind of like buying $100 bills for $100. If I bid less, then I'll actually gain by winning the auction. And the more I lower my bid, the more I'll gain. Of course, the trouble is that by lowering my bid, there's a greater chance that someone else will outbid me. If I bid my actual evaluation, then I always gain zero. If I bid less than that evaluation or that valuation, I sometimes make zero if I lose, and sometimes more. So again, shading making my bid less than my valuation dominates bidding my full valuation. My best strategy is to shade. It takes sophisticated calculus and probability theory to determine exactly how much you should shade. The basic idea is that shading helps you by giving you a bigger surplus when you win, but it hurts you by making it less likely that you will win. The optimal amount of shading exactly balances these two effects. To provide you an example that's about as mathematically simple as you can get, let's imagine that we have two bidders for the auction, and the private value of the object for each bidder is equally likely to be any number between $0 and $100. When you work out all the math, auction theory says that the optimal bids, the only Nash equilibrium in this game, is for each bidder to bid exactly 1/2 of what that item is worth to them. That's considerable shading. Okay, so in a private value Dutch auction or a sealed bid first price private value auction, you need to shade your bids, just like you do in a common value auction. Figuring out how much is problematic, though. Here's where things get interesting. Let's look at second price sealed bid auctions for a private value object. This is going to be essentially equivalent to an English or ascending auction. The high bidder wins, but only pays the amount of what the second highest bid is. What's going to be the optimal bidding strategy now? Shade? I'm going to argue that in this kind of auction, you should bid your true valuation. No more, no less. Let's see why. Let's imagine that the object is worth exactly $100 to you. If you're not going to bid exactly 100, you could bid more or less. Let's see what happens if you bid more. The idea of bidding more than your valuation isn't ridiculous at this point. After all, you're not going to pay your bid if you win, only the second highest bid, the one right below yours. So let's say that you bid more than $100, maybe $110 to fix ideas. There are three possibilities. First, the high bid comes in at above $110. In that case, you don't win at $110, and you wouldn't have won at $100. Both of those bids do equally well. Second possibility, the second highest bid is at most $100, so you win. But of course, you would have won with your $100 bid as well. So both bids have you paying the same amount of money, the second highest bid, and winning. Again, they're both equally good. But there's a third possibility. The second highest bid might be between 100 and 110. If you bid 100, you lose and have no gain. If you bid 110, you win the auction, but you have to pay an amount which is more than what you think it's worth, $100. You're losing money on the deal. So by bidding 100, in that case, we do better than bidding 110. 100 is always as good as 110 and sometimes better. This means that bidding 100 weakly dominates bidding more. Okay, how about bidding less? To fix ideas, suppose that you bid $90. I want to see how this bid does when compared to your bidding your full valuation, or 100. Again, there can be three cases. First, someone bids more than 100. They win if you bid 90 or if you bid 100. Both bids do equally well. Second possibility, the highest bid is 90 or less. In this case, you win with a $90 bid or a $100 bid. And in both cases, you're paying the same amount of money, the second highest bid. So again, a $90 bid and a $100 bid do equally well. The last possibility is that some bid comes in between $90 and $100. If you bid 90, you lose, gaining zero. If you bid 100, you win. You have to pay the second highest price, but that's between $90 and $100. You think the item's worth 100, so you're making money on the deal. Putting it together, we see that bidding $100 weakly dominates your bidding less. This was why Vickrey proposed this kind of auction. In a sealed bid, second price, private value auction, each bidder's optimal strategy is to bid his or her true valuation of the object. This raises an interesting question. Which kind of auction is best? The seller usually gets to decide what kind of auction is held. For the seller, the best auction would be the one that, on average, generates the highest price. Well, we've seen our knee-jerk reaction that a first price auction would generate more money than a second price auction was premature. We really have to ask, which is higher? The shaded price that you would see in a first price auction, or the second highest true valuation that you would see in a second price auction? Well, a celebrated result of auction theory answers this question. It's called the revenue equivalence theorem. It assumes that the bidders are risk neutral, that they care about their expected surplus from the auction. And it says that as long as the valuations of the bidders are independent from one another, all four auction types give exactly the same average payoff. In fact, it applies to almost any reasonable auction structure and includes such possibilities as the all-pay auction, in which every bidder pays whatever he or she bids, but only the winner gets the object. If risk-neutral bidders bid optimally, then on average, it really doesn't matter what auction system you adopt. Since in the past we've seen some disparity between theoretical and observed results in other areas of game theory, it's probably appropriate to look at experimental results for this revenue equivalence theorem as well. What you get from experimental evidence depends on whether the auction was done in real time or on the internet. Real time first. For real-time auctions, Dutch auctions, descending, tend to generate lower sale prices than first-price sealed bid auctions, perhaps because of the thrill of suspense as the clock counts down. Second-price sealed bid auctions show a pattern of overbidding, bidding more than your valuation. And even though they're equivalent to English auctions, you don't see that effect there. On the internet, second-price sealed bid auctions and English auctions do show revenue equivalence, while Dutch auctions, interestingly, generally generate higher sale prices than first-price sealed bid auctions. This is a reversal from the real-time auctions, where Dutch auctions resulted in lower sale prices. It may be due to impatience with waiting for the clock to count down for days to a lower price on the online Dutch auctions. We've also seen that many people are risk-averse. The revenue equivalence theorem doesn't apply to such bidders. A risk-averse bidder is more concerned about not getting the item than about bidding close to his or her valuation. That is, risk-averse bidders shade less than do risk-neutral ones. That means that a Dutch auction or first-price sealed bid auction will tend to generate more revenue than an English auction or a Vickrey auction would. So, with risk-averse bidders, the seller is wiser to adopt a Dutch or first-price sealed bid system. Real-life data is useful, and some of it is a warning to anyone who wants to design an auction. It's important to remember that the theoretical analysis tells people the best way for bidders to play your auction game. That doesn't mean they'll do that. In fact, in some cases, it doesn't even mean that they're playing your game. Some lovely cases in point come from auctions of the radio frequency spectrum in various countries. The examples I'm about to discuss have been examined by a number of authors, but the best treatment that I've found is in Tim Hartford's delightful account in The Undercover Economist. I mentioned in the first lecture how the FCC raised over $400 billion in its first 5 years of spectrum auctions, and mentioned earlier today how it made $19 billion in spring of 2008 alone. But the history of spectrum auctions is not without blemish. After the first several years of successful auctions, things went very wrong. In particular, April 1997. The spectrum auction held then raised less than 1% of the monies expected. As Hartford pointed out, this is like putting your $300,000 house on the auction block and getting less than $3,000 for it. What went wrong? Well, what went wrong was that the game theorists who designed the auction missed that they were actually playing a larger game. Remember, spectrum auction bids are conducted in a series of rounds. All the geographical regions for the spectrum are auctioned simultaneously. We said this was a good idea. A company is more willing to commit more money to buying a cellular license in Washington, D.C., if it knows it can also acquire the Baltimore license. All the bids are also public. So, what would make bids like $33,540 and $51,540 and $46,540 start showing up? What's that $540 doing there? And such bids were appearing, bids with endings like 483. Does it help you if I tell you that 483 are the digits that you'd push on your telephone to get the letters G, T, E? Bidders were signaling to each other with the least significant digits of their bid. They might end the bids with an area code they were particularly interested in, or with a company identifier, but the purpose was the same in each case, warning other bidders that the company was serious about this particular block of frequencies. If you bid up the price there, you were in for a fight, and you'd be punished elsewhere, in later rounds or in later auctions. Essentially, bidders could collude, and those warned off could be compensated for not competing by having no competition in future auctions. The results were as gut-wrenching for the FCC as your $300,000 house going for $3,000. Other countries have also held spectrum auctions with less than satisfactory results, but the problems weren't always a breakdown in game theory. Take New Zealand. It was holding spectrum auctions as early as 1990. They chose the Vickery auction, a sealed bid, second price auction. As we've seen, this seems a perfectly reasonable choice. If the bidders are risk neutral, any reasonable auction system should generate the same amount of mean revenue. As we've seen, the Vickery auction is easier to bid with. It encourages higher bids than the English, but it's easy to figure out how much you should bid, your true valuation. Yeah, we know that, but the New Zealand press didn't, neither did the New Zealand public. In an English auction, you never know how high the top bidder would have gone if pressed. But in a Vickery auction, you do. So, the public wanted to know why someone who would bid about $72,000 for a license got it for a bit over $4, and why a bidder who had offered over $5 million ended up only paying about $3,600. This actually has nothing to do with game theory and everything to do with the public perception. But the results were predictably bad. The auctions were seen as a failure of the New Zealand government. But in spite of these troubles, auctions had, and have, some important virtues. Perhaps the biggest one is the matter of making sure that the limited public resource, the airwaves, go to those who can best use that resource. How else are you going to determine this? You could ask the companies, but it's not a good idea. It's cheap talk, an incredible signal. Each company would have every reason to try to convince you that they were the best choice, regardless of the actual capabilities. Ask the experts? As Hartford points out, in a highly technical and fast-moving field like wireless communication, most of the experts are going to have ties to the very companies interested in the licenses. That's even assuming that they could correctly assess the value of trade secrets or different technologies. But an auction replaces this cheap talk with an expensive bid. It simply isn't in a company's best interest to bid more for a piece of the spectrum than the company believes it can gain from it. And on the other hand, why drop out while the price is still lower than you're confident that you can make? The structure of the spectrum auctions had an additional handy feature too. Except for a limited number of passes, you had to keep bidding each round or quit the auction. This means that you can get a better idea of how reasonable your valuation might be by watching your competitors and seeing if they stay in or drop out at those prices. Well, we've seen that auctions can be serious business, but maybe the size of the figures involved here has made it seem divorced from your life. Let me give you an example that's closer to home. Google, the internet search engine. As I mentioned earlier, over 99% of Google's revenues come from ads. With their AdWords service, any small business can have a web presence. Essentially, you tell Google the keywords associated with your product or service. When someone searches on one of these words, your sponsored link may appear on the results page. You pay Google a certain amount of money for each person who clicks on your link or for every 1,000 people that see your link or ad. Where your link appears and how much you pay for it is the results of an auction. Google developed their system in-house, and in doing so, they inadvertently reinvented the Vickery auction, but with a twist. You see, when you register for AdWords, you tell Google the most that you're willing to pay for a click. but your actual charge is based on the second highest bidder, just like a Vickrey auction. Google essentially looks at how much expected revenue you'll pay times the number of clicks they think that you'll get. Whatever sponsor has the highest total for that gets the first slot. But since more than one slot's available, many advertisers have discovered that by shading their bids, they can save big bucks. One 2006 report estimated that Google's system generally generates 30% more per ad impression than its main competitor, Yahoo. Buying on eBay, selling on Google, or determining who's going to be providing you with cell phone service next year, auctions are everywhere. That old auctioneer's cry is strangely mal apropos. The last expression that would apply to the future of auctions would have to be going, gone.